22 days married. Then a bullet on a Denver street. Silas Soule had survived the bloodiest fighting of the Civil War. He'd walked into a Virginia prison to attempt one of the most daring rescues in American history. He'd escaped bounty hunters who wanted him dead before he turned 20. But he couldn't survive telling the truth about what happened at Sand Creek. November 29, 1864, dawn on the Colorado Plains, 700 U.S. Soldiers surrounded a village of sleeping Cheyenne and Arapaho families. They had come under a flag of peace. They had been told they were protected. Instead, they woke to gunfire. And while hundreds of soldiers opened fire on women, children, and old men, while the sand turned red with blood, one young officer stood apart. He looked at his commander. He looked at the massacre unfolding in front of him. And he gave an order that would make him the most hunted man in the territory. Hold your fire, do not shoot. His name was Silas Soule. And what happened next is why Cheyenne still visits his grave 160 years later. There are moments in history when one person's decision changes the story we tell about ourselves as a nation. Sometimes that person becomes famous. Their name appears in textbooks. Statues are built, streets are renamed. But sometimes that person is forgotten, erased from memory by time, politics, or the people who wanted them silenced. This is a story about a man who should be a household name in America. A man who, by the age of 16, was already risking his life to help enslaved people escape to freedom. A man who, at 21, walked into a Virginia prison trying to rescue followers of John Brown. A man who, at 26, refused to participate in one of the worst atrocities ever committed on American soil, and then testified against his own commander, knowing full well it would probably get him killed. His name was Silas Soule. He was born July 26, 1838, and died April 23, 1865. He was an American abolitionist, a teenage conductor on the Underground Railroad, a military officer, and an early example of what would later be called a whistleblower. He was only 27 years old when he died, and almost nobody today knows who he was. But the Cheyenne and Arapaho people remember. Every year, they visit the grave of Silas Soule during the annual healing run to honor victims of the Sand Creek Massacre. They remember him because, on a cold November morning in 1864, when hundreds of soldiers opened fire on their sleeping ancestors, one man stood apart. One man looked at the chaos unfolding around him and made a choice that defied everything: his orders, his commander, the popular opinion of the day. He chose humanity over obedience, and it would be the beginning of the end for him. To understand who Silas Soule was and why his story matters so much today, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to understand the world he grew up in, the values that were planted in him as a child, and the series of extraordinary events that shaped him into the man who would eventually stand on the right side of history, even when standing there alone. Silas Soule was born in the town of Bath, Maine. The family later moved outside of Boston, Massachusetts. Silas's parents were very progressive. They had strong abolitionist beliefs, and Silas's father, Massacre Soule, belonged to many anti-slavery groups. The Soule household was not a quiet, neutral place when it came to the great moral question of the era. He was raised in an abolitionist New England household. His family could trace its roots in America to the Mayflower. This mattered. In an America that was deeply divided over slavery. The Soule family had chosen their side long before Silas was old enough to understand what that choice meant. They believed in human dignity. They believed that no person should be owned by another person. And they were willing to act on those beliefs, even when acting was dangerous. In 1854, the Kansas Territory was opened to settlers from the United States. Since Kansas bordered both free and slaveholding states, it was uncertain if Kansas would become a free state or slave state. This was not just a political question, it was a battle for the future of America itself. If Kansas became a slave state, the power of the slaveholding South would grow stronger. If it became free, the balance might tip in the other direction. Both sides understood the stakes, and so people began moving to Kansas, not just to settle, but to fight. Captain Soule's father, Silas Soule, was sent out to Kansas as an agent of the Emigrant Aid Society of Boston in the spring or early summer of 1854. He took up a homestead on Coal Creek, about 10 miles south of what was afterwards the town of Lawrence, and established the first underground railroad station in the then territory of Kansas. He was at the head of the operations of this work for Kansas, Missouri, and Arkansas. Think about that for a moment. Silas Soule didn't just oppose slavery from the comfort of his New England home. He packed up his family and moved them to the front lines of what would become America's bloodiest conflict before the Civil War even officially began. Silas, his second son and the subject of this sketch, was at the time a boy of 10 or 12 years. He was raised in a very active abolitionist atmosphere and before the Civil War started. While yet in his teens, he became an active jayhawker. The Soule home in Kansas became something extraordinary and dangerous. The Soules moved to Kansas in the mid-1850s to help sway the territory into becoming a free rather than slave-holding state. They became close friends of abolitionist John Brown and their home in Lawrence. Kansas was an important stop on the Underground Railroad. John Brown, even today, his name carries tremendous weight. He was a radical abolitionist who believed that slavery could only be ended through armed resistance. He was a man who would later be executed by the federal government for his raid on Harper's Ferry, an event that helped spark the Civil War itself. And he was a regular visitor at the Soule family home. Silas's sister, Anne, told of her family's early experience. John Brown was often there. My brother Silas and Brown were close friends. Silas went out on many a foray with him. I recall well when Brown came to our cabin one night with 13 slaves. Men, women, and children, he had run them away from Missouri. Brown left them with us. Father would always take in all the Negroes he could. Young Silas watched all of this. He saw enslaved people arriving at his family's home in the dead of night, frightened and exhausted after their dangerous journey from Missouri. He saw his father welcome them without hesitation. He saw them fed, sheltered, and then sent on to the next stop on their journey to freedom. And soon he wasn't just watching, he was participating. By 16, Silas was working as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, leading escaped slaves between Underground Railroad stops into freedom. It was extremely dangerous work, as conductor and slaves were always at risk of imprisonment or death. At an age when most teenagers today are worried about school and social media, Silas Soule was guiding families through the darkness, helping them escape from bondage, knowing that if he was caught, he could be imprisoned or worse. At the age of 17, Silas escorted escaped slaves from Missouri north to freedom. The territory of Kansas during this period earned a dark name that captured the violence consuming it. Fighting between abolitionists and slaveholders in Kansas was so violent that the territory was commonly referred to as Bleeding Kansas. During the late 1850s, pro-slavery forces from Missouri and abolitionist forces from Kansas were engaged in open warfare. The conflict was over whether Kansas would be admitted to the Union as a slave or free state. This period was often called Bleeding Kansas. This wasn't a metaphor. People were actually dying. Armed men from both sides roamed the countryside. Farms were burned, families were murdered. It was, in many ways, a preview of the Civil War that would consume the entire nation just a few years later. And Silas Soule was right in the middle of it. Silas joined the Jayhawkers, the name given to Kansas's abolitionist militia. He became one of Brown's allies, and rode with him and his sons in many of their raids against the pro-slavery settlements along the Kansas-Missouri border. Both sides became known by many names, including border ruffians for the pro-slavery factions, and Jayhawkers for Brown and like-minded groups. Silas Soule developed the reputation of being one of the most dangerous of the Jayhawkers. By his late teens, Silas was not just a young man with strong beliefs. He was a guerrilla fighter. He had learned how to survive in a violent, lawless world where death could come at any moment. He had proven his courage under fire again and again. Silas became an expert in hit-and-run guerrilla warfare tactics, utilizing carbines that had been sent from pro-abolition groups in New England in crates marked Bibles. Still just a teen, Silas became a member of the Jayhawker 10, also known as the Immortal 10 or Terrible 10. These men were an elite militia group who conducted raids, liberated enslaved people, and freed jailed abolitionists. The Immortal 10, the Terrible 10, these were the names given to Silas and his fellow fighters. And in 1859, they would prove how they earned those names. On January 25, 1859, 20 pro-slavery men had crossed into Kansas to look for escaped slaves. They located and ambushed an Underground Railroad party led by Dr. John Doy, a physician in Lawrence, who was escorting 13 former slaves to Iowa. The men from Missouri arrested Dr. Doy and sold the former slaves. Doy, meanwhile, was tried and convicted of abducting slaves and sentenced to 5 years in a Missouri penitentiary. Dr. John Doy was a good man who had risked everything to help enslaved people reach freedom. Now he was sitting in a jail cell in Missouri, awaiting transfer to prison for the crime of believing that all people deserved liberty. The Jayhawkers decided they weren't going to let that stand. Because he was awaiting transfer to the prison at the jailhouse in St. Joseph, Soule and a group of men from Lawrence decided they would free him. What happened next shows just how clever and how fearless young Silas Soule had become. Soule went into the jail and convinced the jailkeeper that he had a letter from Doy's wife. The note, in fact, read, "Tonight at 12 o'clock. Later that night, they overpowered the jailer and helped Doy escape back to Kansas. Thereafter known as the Immortal 10, when they reached Lawrence, they had their photo taken." Silas was instrumental in the jail rescue of Dr. John Doy, a local physician and abolitionist who had been apprehended by pro-slavery advocates. This wasn't just a bold rescue, it was a statement. It said that the Jayhawkers would not abandon their own. It said that justice was not something they would wait for, it was something they would create with their own hands. The Jayhawker rescue of a man considered innocent by Free State sympathizers was considered an ultimate act of heroism. And it wasn't long before an even more dangerous mission presented itself. On October 16, 1859, John Brown led his famous raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. The abolitionist John Brown led a group of 21 men in a raid on the arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Virginia. Brown's plan was ambitious. He intended to seize weapons and spark a massive slave rebellion that would spread across the South. The raid failed. Brown was captured along with several of his followers. The federal government quickly tried him for treason and conspiracy. The verdict was never in doubt. John Brown was sentenced to hang. When word reached Kansas, the Jayhawkers refused to accept that their leader would die without them at least trying to save him. He was one of the members of the Dow Band, comprising 12 men, pledged to the cause of John Brown of Osawatomie when Brown was condemned to hang at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. These 12 men formed a plan to rescue John Brown. They established a pony relay extending from Osawatomie to Harper's Ferry, and Silas Soule was chosen to make personal contact with John Brown and arrange for his rescue. Think about this mission for a moment. Silas Soule, barely 21 years old, was chosen from among all the Jayhawkers to be the one to travel hundreds of miles into enemy territory, make contact with the most wanted man in America, and somehow arrange his escape from a heavily guarded prison. It was a suicide mission, but Silas went anyway. When Soule arrived in Charlestown in mid-November, he had himself arrested. How he did so is disputed, but he likely either created a public disturbance or was drunk or both. At any rate, once in jail, he persuaded the jailer to allow him to speak with Brown. The conversation did not go well, at least not in the point of view of those conspiring to free him. As part of this plan, Soule posed as a drunken Irishman, got himself arrested for brawling, and was put into the Charlestown jail for the night. He managed to charm the jailer into letting him out of his cell for a short while, during which he contacted the two prisoners. This young man from Kansas had successfully infiltrated a Virginia prison. He had made contact with John Brown himself. The rescue plan was in motion. But then something unexpected happened. John Brown did not want to be rescued. He knew he was going to the gallows, and he believed his martyrdom would inspire more people to take up his cause. He refused to be persuaded otherwise. John Brown wanted to die, secure in his religious beliefs that it was his destiny. He established the contact, but Brown did not approve of the plan of rescue and contended that his execution would do more to bring about the abolition of slavery than he could possibly accomplish by a continuation of border warfare in Kansas and Missouri. He told Soule that he thanked the Dow Party for their plan and work for his delivery, but that the cause was greater than the man. That life was only an incident in the great struggle for human liberty. John Brown looked at Silas Soule and essentially told him, "Let me die. My death will matter more than my life." Silas never got the chance to do so when Brown learned a rescue attempt was being planned. He sent a message that he would rather become a martyr for his cause. John Brown was executed on December 2, 1859. The experience must have been profound for young Silas. He had risked everything to save this man, and the man had chosen death over rescue. It was a powerful lesson about conviction, about sacrifice, about what some people are willing to give up for what they believe. But Silas wasn't done yet. After John Brown was captured following the raid on Harper's Ferry, Soule once again found himself planning a jailbreak. In February 1860, after Brown had been tried, convicted, and executed, Soule visited Brown's followers, Albert Hazlitt and Aaron Dwight Stevens, jailed at Charlestown, and offered to help the men escape. From there, he was able to make his way to where the two men were held. They rejected his offer of rescue, saying they would follow in John Brown's footsteps and be executed as well. Twice, Silas Soule had risked his life to rescue condemned prisoners. Twice, those prisoners had chosen death over freedom. Silas was disillusioned after his failed rescue attempts in Virginia. He did not think it was right that Brown and his men would rather die than continue to fight. The experiences in Virginia had changed him. He had seen up close what it meant to believe in something so strongly that you would die for it. He had also learned that sometimes doing the right thing doesn't lead to the outcome you hope for. But he didn't give up. He didn't become cynical. he took those lessons with him into the next chapter of his life. While in Virginia, he received word from his family that the Terrible 10 were being hunted in Kansas. They warned him not to return right away. Silas decided to take time off from his life as a jayhawker and moved to Boston, where he had lived as a child. The Soules warned their son not to return to Kansas after the events at Harper's Ferry. At 19, he was already a notorious guerrilla fighter with a bounty on his head. At 19 years old, Silas Soule had already lived enough adventure for several lifetimes. He had helped enslaved people escape to freedom. He had fought in the violent battles of Bleeding Kansas. He had walked into enemy prisons and confronted some of the most wanted men in America. And he was just getting started. He spent a year in Boston working as a printer in a publishing company. There he became friends with the poet Walt Whitman, the man who would become one of America's most celebrated poets, the author of Leaves of Grass, and now a friend of young Silas Soule. His letters to Walt Whitman are in the Library of Congress. The friendship between the young jayhawker and the poet is a reminder that Silas was more than just a fighter. The letters reveal a man who was witty, thoughtful, and deeply devoted to his family. But history had other plans for Silas Soule. The gold rush was calling. In mid-1860, Silas learned that his father had gotten ill and passed away. Silas's brother William, who was also tired of years of fighting, moved to Colorado after their father's death. There, as with many others, the talk of the gold fields in Colorado caught his attention, and in the spring of 1860 Soule traveled to Colorado in company of his brother and a cousin, intent on striking it rich in the region near Denver. As with so many others, the promise of gold was far greater than the amount of gold actually found. Silas eventually made his way to Colorado, where his older brother had found success as a miner. With his brother William, he headed west to Colorado to make his fortune. While he was not a successful miner, Silas worked briefly as a blacksmith. For a brief moment, it seemed like Silas Soule might settle into a quiet life. The violence of Kansas was behind him. The failed rescue missions were memories. Maybe he could find peace in the mountains of Colorado, working with his hands, building a new life far from the conflicts that had defined his youth. But then came 1861. In 1861, the tensions that had been brewing so long in Kansas and elsewhere boiled over into all-out war. The Colorado Territory quickly raised a volunteer army, the Colorado 1st Regiment, to fight on the side of the Union. The Civil War had begun, and a young man who had already spent years fighting against slavery was not going to sit on the sidelines. Soule enlisted in the 1st Regiment of Colorado Volunteers in 1861, joining the 1st Colorado Infantry. Silas enlisted and became a first lieutenant due to his many years of experience with the Jayhawkers. His experience in Bleeding Kansas had prepared him well for military service. He wasn't just another volunteer who needed to learn how to fight. He already knew. He had been fighting for years. The Colorado Volunteers were sent south to New Mexico, where Confederate forces were trying to extend their control into the Western Territories. If the Confederates succeeded, they would have access to Colorado's gold fields, money that could fund their war effort. The Union couldn't let that happen. On March 28, 1862, the Colorado 1st Regiment successfully repelled a Confederate attempt to cross into Colorado and New Mexico territory. The Battle of Glorieta Pass prevented Confederate influence from spreading into the West. During his tragically short lifetime, Silas transporting slaves via the Underground Railroad, aided in the jailbreak of a doctor accused of aiding slaves, took part in an attempt to rescue John Brown's men after Harper's Ferry, and fought for the Union at the little-known but very important Battle of the Glorieta Pass. The Battle of Glorieta Pass is sometimes called the Gettysburg of the West. It was a pivotal moment in the Civil War, though it rarely receives the attention of battles fought in the East. Silas Soule was there, fighting hand-to-hand in some of the war's most intense combat. In recognition, the Union promoted the Colorado 1st Regiment to an official United States cavalry unit. During the war, Soule joined the Colorado Volunteers and rose to the rank of captain in the Union Army. Captain Silas Soule. At just 24 years old, he was now an officer in the United States military, commanding men in a war that would determine the future of the nation. But the war against the Confederacy was not the only conflict consuming the West. As the Civil War began to wind down, another conflict was heating up, one that would test Silas Soule's conscience in ways he could never have imagined. As the Civil War began to wind down, especially in the West, the Army began to focus on another objective: assimilating America's indigenous peoples. Silas and his co-leader at Fort Lyon, Edward Wynkoop, believed that the local tribes should be treated with respect and fairness in these dealings. But they were in the minority among military officials. Soule and Wynkoop helped negotiate important early treaties with the Cheyenne and Arapaho people in Colorado. He was later promoted to captain and assigned to guard mountain passes along the Santa Fe Trail. In this capacity, Soule worked as a liaison with native leaders and helped to frame several treaties between the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. This is a crucial detail in understanding who Silas Soule was. He was not a man who simply followed orders without thinking. He engaged with the indigenous people of Colorado. He learned about them. He participated in peace negotiations. He understood that they were human beings with their own culture, their own way of life, their own desire to live in peace. Captain Silas Soule and Major Edward Wynkoop helped negotiate two important treaties with Colorado's native Cheyenne and Arapaho populations. The first was the Smoky Hill Council, where the United States promised peace to the Cheyenne chief Black Kettle in exchange for the return of 4 white children who had been kidnapped. The second was the Camp Weld Council in late September 1864. The Cheyenne and Arapaho left the Camp Weld Council believing they had made peace and were under the protection of the United States government. Silas Soule and Edward Wynkoop thought peace had been made as well. However, it is commonly believed that Colonel Chivington and Governor Evans, who were present at the council, were already planning an attack on the two tribes. This is where our story takes its darkest turn. Because while Silas Soule and Ned Wynkoop were working for peace, others were working toward something very different. Many Coloradans, including Colonel Chivington and Territorial Governor John Evans, believed that native tribes would kill all settlers unless they were killed first. Colonel John Chivington, remember that name, he was Silas Soule's commanding officer. He was a former Methodist minister who thought all Indians posed a threat to white settlement in Colorado. The Rocky Mountain News had called for the active extermination against the Red Devils. The governor called for atrocities against indigenous peoples. This was the atmosphere in Colorado in late 1864. Fear, hatred, calls for violence. And in the middle of it all, a peace chief named Black Kettle who just wanted his people to survive. Black Kettle, leading chief of around 163 mostly Southern Cheyenne, had led his band, joined by some Arapahos under Chief Niwot, to Fort Lyon in compliance with provisions of a peace parley held in Denver in September 1864. After a while, the American Indians were asked to relocate to Big Sandy Creek, less than 40 miles northwest of Fort Lyon, under the threat of their safety. Black Kettle had done everything he was asked to do. He had attended peace conferences. He had brought his people to the designated location. He had accepted promises of protection from the United States government. Black Kettle flew a U.S. flag, with a white flag tied beneath it over his lodge, as the Fort Lyon commander had advised him. An American flag, a white flag of surrender beneath it. Flying over Black Kettle's lodge, the universal symbols of peace and surrender displayed prominently for all to see. At the time, Sand Creek was a designated safe haven for the women, children, and elderly of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. The Dog Soldiers, who had been responsible for many of the attacks and raids on whites, were not part of this encampment. Most tribal warriors stood their ground, refusing to leave their home under the guise of a threat, leaving only about 75 men, plus all the women and children in the village. The men who remained were mostly too old or too young to hunt. This was not a military target. This was not a camp full of warriors preparing for battle. This was a village of families, old men, women, and children, who had been promised protection by the American government. And Colonel John Chivington was coming. Meanwhile, Chivington and 425 men of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry rode to Fort Lyon, arriving on November 28, 1864. Once at the fort, Chivington took command of 250 men of the 1st Colorado Cavalry and maybe as many as 12 men of the 1st Regiment New Mexico Volunteer Infantry. Then set out for Black Kettle's encampment. Chivington received Governor Evans's permission to countermand Wynkoop's peace efforts and march on the encampment at Sand Creek. He marched in secret and arrived in Fort Lyon on November 28, 1864. Colonel Chivington ordered the fort closed. No one was allowed to enter or leave the fort before the attack. The Indians were not to be warned. The secrecy tells you everything you need to know. Chivington knew what he was about to do was wrong. That's why he closed the fort. That's why he wouldn't allow anyone to leave. He didn't want word to reach the village. He didn't want anyone to stop him. Prior to the massacre, several of Antony's officers were not eager to join in the attack. Captain Silas Soule, Lieutenant Joseph Kramer, and Lieutenant James Connor protested that attacking a peaceful camp would violate the pledge of safety provided to the Indians and would dishonor the uniform of the army. Silas Soule saw what was happening, and he spoke up. Before the attack, Soule told other officers, any man who would take part in such murders, knowing the circumstances as we did, was a low-lived, cowardly son of a bitch. Lt. Joseph Kramer and Soule went directly to Major Scott Antony, Chivington's superior. They tried to stop it. They went up the chain of command. They objected. They protested. It didn't matter. Chivington was determined. And so, on the morning of November 29, 1864, the order was given to attack. The following morning, Chivington gave the order to attack. 2 officers, Captain Silas Soule and Lieutenant Joseph Kramer, commanding Company D and Company K of the 1st Colorado Cavalry, refused to obey and told their men to hold fire. Soule was present at the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, commanding the 1st Colorado Cavalry, Company D, but refused to take part in the killing, and ordered his men not to harm the Native Americans, while over 600 soldiers opened fire on a sleeping village of families, while chaos and death spread across the frozen creek bed. Captain Silas Soule and his men did not fire a single shot. As the attack began, Soule reminded his troops that the supposed enemy was a peace chief's band, and some responded that they would not fire a shot today. His company did not follow the orders given to them to enter the creek bed leading to the settlement, but moved up and down the banks and observed the slaughter. They watched, they couldn't stop it, but they wouldn't participate in it. His actions saved many innocent lives, as none of the soldiers under his command fired upon the villagers, who had either fallen to their knees or ran from the village. The massacre lasted for hours. Over the course of 8 hours, the troops killed around 230 Cheyenne and Arapaho people composed mostly of women, children, and the elderly. Captain Silas Soule of the Colorado Cavalry refused to participate in the 1864 Sand Creek Massacre, where 150 unarmed Cheyenne and Arapaho women and children were murdered. Most sources estimate around 150 people were killed, about 2/3 of whom were women and children. At dawn on November 29, Chivington attacked the Sand Creek Reservation. Most of the warriors were out hunting. Black Kettle had waved an American flag around to get the soldiers to halt their attack. The few warriors available tried to fight back along the river, but they were far outnumbered. Black Kettle and his wife began to run for the creek, and his wife was shot 9 times. Black Kettle escaped the massacre and returned to rescue his severely injured wife, who suffered 9 bullet and shrapnel wounds. He continued to counsel pacifism, believing that military resistance was doomed to fail. The peace chief, who had done everything right, who had attended the negotiations, who had flown the American flag, who had trusted the government's promises, barely escaped with his life. His wife, shot 9 times, somehow survived, and Silas Soule had witnessed all of it. His military service ultimately placed him at Sand Creek on Nov. 29, 1864, where he refused to participate in the massacre of hundreds of Cheyenne and Arapaho people. In the weeks after the massacre, Soule wrote a meticulous and damning letter to Officer Ned Wynkoop, detailing the atrocities he witnessed. He could have stayed silent, he could have kept his head down. He could have protected his career, his reputation, his safety. But that wasn't who Silas Soule was. That wasn't the man his parents had raised. That wasn't the young conductor who had led enslaved people to freedom on the Underground Railroad. That wasn't the Jayhawker who had walked into a Virginia prison to try to rescue John Brown. Silas Soule was going to tell the truth, and it would cost him everything. In the days after the Sand Creek Massacre, Colonel John Chivington and his men returned to Denver as heroes. The streets were lined with cheering crowds. He was angry that Chivington had described the massacre as a battle, and that members of the Colorado Cavalry were treated like heroes afterward. The local newspapers celebrated what they called a great victory against hostile Indians. Scalps taken from the victims were displayed in a Denver theater between acts of a performance. The crowd applauded, but Silas Soule knew the truth, and he could not stay silent. He was determined to prove the truth of what happened that day. Silas wrote letters to Ned Wynkoop, explaining the graphic violence of the massacre. On December 14, 1864, 2 weeks after the Sand Creek Massacre, Captain Silas Soule wrote to his friend Ned Wynkoop. Dear Ned, 2 days after you left, here the 3rd Regt arrived. They declared their intention to massacre the friendly Indians camped at Sand Creek. I told them I would not take part in their intended murder. The letter that Silas wrote was not just a complaint. It was a detailed account of everything he had witnessed, every horror, every injustice, every broken promise. The massacre lasted 6 to 8 hours. I tell you, Ned, it was hard to see little children. It was almost impossible to save any of them. These were not easy words to write. Silas knew that by putting them on paper, he was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. He was accusing his commanding officer of murder. He was calling heroes villains. He was standing against the popular opinion of an entire territory. Silas wrote letters to congressmen in Washington, D.C. and to his friend Walt Whitman, telling the truth of what happened November 29th, and that it was not at all the glorious battle Chivington described. He didn't just write to one person, he wrote to everyone who might listen. He was determined that the truth would not be buried along with the victims. And Colonel Chivington noticed. In his letter, Chivington mentioned that he would be keeping close watch on a troublesome captain named Silas Soule, who had proved himself a greater friend to the Indians than the whites. A greater friend to the Indians than the whites. In Colorado in 1864, that was not a compliment, it was a threat. But Silas would not be intimidated. When the letters reached Washington, they caused an uproar. Soule's and Kramer's detailed accounts prompted the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War and the U.S. Army to launch investigations of the massacre in early 1865. The federal government was going to investigate what happened at Sand Creek. And Silas Soule would be called to testify. This was exactly what Silas had hoped for. But it also meant something else. He would have to publicly accuse John Chivington, a powerful man with powerful friends, of crimes that could ruin Chivington's career and reputation forever. At the time of the Sand Creek controversy in 1865, Captain Soule, Major Edward Wynkoop, Lt. Joseph Kramer, and Lt. Colonel Samuel Tappan were accused of conspiring to lie about Sand Creek in order to destroy Chivington's reputation and political ambitions. Chivington and his supporters fought back. They claimed that Soule and the others were liars, conspirators, traitors. They said the testimony was nothing but a political plot to destroy a hero. But Silas had evidence. He had witnessed everything with his own eyes. And he was not alone. Other officers who had been at Sand Creek would corroborate his account. The investigation lasted 76 days and generated hundreds of pages of testimony from soldiers, civilians, and Indians. 76 days, hundreds of pages, witness after witness telling the same story that Silas Soule had documented in his letter. Soule gives a detailed description of the attitude and movements of the Cheyenne Indians and the Colorado cavalry forces prior to the conflict, as well as a summary of the actual events that occurred on Sand Creek. Although this commission was not a military trial, the format of taking witness testimony was similar. Colonel John Chivington, commander of the 1st Colorado, was allowed to cross-examine the witnesses called by the commission. Think about that moment, Silas Soule sitting in a room being questioned about what he saw. And across from him, John Chivington, the man he was accusing. The man whose career he was destroying, asking him questions, challenging his account, trying to discredit him. It took courage beyond measure. Silas knew that powerful men were watching. He knew that his testimony would make him enemies. He knew that some of those enemies might try to silence him permanently. During hearings in Denver, Captain Soule's integrity and unwavering testimony turned the tide against the once popular Chivington and the other men who participated in the massacre and mutilations at Sand Creek. Captain Soule fully realized that telling the truth about the massacre could cost him his life. Even telling a good friend that he fully expected to be killed for his testimony. He was right, he knew. He told his friends that he expected to be killed. And he testified anyway. During hearings in Denver, Captain Soule's integrity and unwavering testimony turned the tide against the once popular Chivington and the other men who participated in the massacre and mutilations at Sand Creek. Captain Soule fully realized that telling the truth about the massacre could cost him his life. Even telling a good friend that he fully expected to be killed for his testimony. His testimony was devastating. His testimony in early 1865, as the military and the U.S. Congress both investigated Sand Creek. was listed among the reasons that the battle was reclassified a massacre. Because of Silas Soule, what Chivington called a battle would forever be known as a massacre. The truth was finally being told. Their reports, published in 1865 Congress and 1867 U.S. Army, prevented the details of the massacre from being swept under the rug. A military investigation heard testimony from Soule, Kramer, Wynkoop, and natives that survived the attack. The investigators concluded Chivington knew of the Indians at Sand Creek, friendly character, having himself been instrumental to some extent in placing them in their position of fancied security. Yet he took advantage of their inapprehension and defenseless condition to gratify the worst passions that ever cursed the heart of man. Those words, the worst passions that ever cursed the heart of man, that's what the official investigation concluded about John Chivington's actions. He wanted to become a governor or politician, but his political hopes were ruined once he became known as the Butcher of Sand Creek. Chivington never forgave Silas for what he considered a betrayal. But despite the damning findings, Chivington would never face justice in a court of law. Chivington was neither court-martialed nor prosecuted. By the time the investigation concluded, Chivington had already left the military. There was no mechanism to punish him for what he had done. He would live the rest of his life a free man, though his reputation was forever tarnished. The investigation was over. Silas had done what he set out to do. The truth was on the record. The victims of Sand Creek would not be forgotten. And now, finally, Silas Soule allowed himself to think about something other than justice for the dead. He allowed himself to think about the future, about love, about happiness. After the end of the investigation, Silas hoped his life would return to normal. He left the army and accepted a job overseeing military police in Denver. He and Ned Wynkoop liked to visit Coberly's Halfway House, a famous saloon between Colorado Springs and Denver. The saloon was run by Sarah Coberly and her 3 daughters. The middle daughter, Hersa, was known for her quick wit and intelligence. She and Silas were often seen laughing and dancing together. Hersa Coberly. She was 19 years old, young, spirited, intelligent. She had grown up on the frontier, the daughter of a woman who ran a saloon by herself after her husband's death. Hersa knew hardship, she knew strength, and she saw those same qualities in Silas. She and Silas were often seen laughing and dancing together. In April of 1865, 26-year-old Silas married 19-year-old Hersa. Because they both liked practical jokes, they married on April Fool's Day so none of their friends would know for sure if they had really gotten married. April Fool's Day, April 1, 1865. Because they both loved to laugh, they chose a wedding date that would keep their friends guessing. Married on April 1, William Byers himself wrote the announcement. William Byers was the editor of the Rocky Mountain News, one of the most prominent men in Denver. The wedding was news. For 3 weeks, Silas Soule was a married man. For 3 weeks, he had a partner, a future, a chance at the quiet life he had never known. He married his longtime sweetheart, 19-year-old Hersa Coberly, on April 1, 1865. Just 3 weeks after her wedding, Hersa found herself a widow. On the night of April 23, the pair were returning home when a gunshot sounded a few blocks away. 22 days, that's all they had. April 1865 was a dark month for the city of Denver. On the 14th, the President of the United States had been murdered. Colorado, 11 years from statehood, was a territory overwhelmingly sympathetic to the Union. News of Lincoln's assassination shook the city to its core. Scarcely over a week later, one of Denver's own, a charismatic cavalry captain named Silas Soule, was murdered in the street. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated on April 14, 1865. Soule's death occurred 2 weeks after the end of the Civil War and 8 days after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. The nation was still reeling from the loss of its president when Denver lost its own hero. While the news of Soule's demise was horrifying, it did not come as a surprise. Soule himself had predicted his assassination numerous times, including the day before his death. The day before he died, Silas Soule told someone he expected to be attacked. He knew. He had always known. The threats had been constant since his testimony. Soule was a provost marshal when he testified against Chivington at the military investigation in the spring of 1865. Prior to his testimony, he received numerous threats from Chivington supporters and narrowly escaped one assassination attempt. There had already been one attempt on his life. He had escaped that one. But on the night of April 23rd, his luck ran out. Our city was thrown into a feverish excitement last evening by assassination of Captain S. Soule of the Colorado 1st. The sad affair took place about 10:30 and was evidently coolly and deliberately planned and as systematically carried out. For some time past, the captain had been in charge of the provost guard of the city and neighborhood, and his duties in that capacity had, as a natural consequence, created many enemies. Threats against his life have been freely and frequently made. That's from the Rocky Mountain News, the day after the murder. They described it as coolly and deliberately planned and as systematically carried out. This was not a random crime. This was an assassination. In the evening, he and his wife were visiting at the house of a friend and returned home between 9 and 10 o'clock. Shortly after, a number of pistol shots were fired in the upper part of the city, evidently to decoy him out, and the captain started to ascertain the cause. Silas and Hersa had spent a pleasant evening with friends. They were walking home together, a young married couple just 3 weeks into their new life. And then they heard gunshots. Silas was the provost marshal. It was his job to investigate disturbances. On April 23rd, just weeks after their marriage, Silas and Hersa were on their way home from visiting friends when they heard shots fired in an alley nearby. Silas went to investigate. He walked right into a trap. Waiting in the dark alley were 2 assassins who shot Silas, killing him instantly. A neighbor of the Soules found Silas minutes later and alerted the police, but his murderers had already disappeared. A trap, the gunshots were bait designed to draw him out. And when he responded, doing his duty, they were waiting for him. At around 10:30 p.m., with his pistol out, Soule faced Charles Squeer. The 2 men, eventually standing only about 4 feet apart. The final act of Soule's life, perhaps, was intended to be an act of mercy. Soule fired a shot that wounded only Squeer's left arm. Squeer then fired a bullet that entered Soule's right cheek, mortally wounding him. The murder occurred on what is now 15th Street, between Lawrence and Arapahoe Streets. Even in his final moment, Silas Soule showed mercy. He fired first, but he only wounded his attacker's arm. Perhaps he was trying to disable rather than kill. Perhaps, even facing his assassin, he couldn't bring himself to take a life unnecessarily. But Charles Squeer showed no such mercy. His bullet struck Silas in the face. Soule was dead before help could arrive. Squeer dropped his pistol and, with an accomplice, ran before he could be arrested by the authorities. Silas Soule was 26 years old. He had been married for 22 days. On April 1, 1865, Soule married Hersa Coberly, the daughter of a well-known Colorado pioneer. Just 3 weeks later, while investigating a drunken disturbance on the streets of downtown Denver, Soule was murdered by Private Charles W. squire of the 2nd Colorado Cavalry, and an accomplice, William Morrow. Charles Squire, William Morrow. The two men had served in Chivington's army. Both of them had been soldiers under Chivington's command. Both of them had reason to hate the man who had testified against their leader. On April 23, several drunken friends of Chivington, Charles Squire and Williamson Morrow, were shooting up the town. Friends of Chivington, that's how one source describes them. Many suspected Chivington hired them to murder Silas, but it was never proven. The suspicion was immediate and widespread. Too many pieces fit together. The killers were Chivington's men. The victim was Chivington's chief accuser. The timing came just months after testimony that destroyed Chivington's reputation. The Sand Creek Inquiry testimonies of Soule and other soldiers and officers of the Colorado 1st Regiment destroyed the reputation of Colonel Chivington, giving rise to speculation that Soule's killers were hired to avenge the hero of La Glorieta. No direct evidence was ever presented, however, to implicate Colonel Chivington in either Soule's murder or Squire's escape from justice. But many Denver residents, including many who once ardently supported the fighting parson, suspected he was behind both crimes. Grief-stricken over the death of his dear friend, Major Wynkoop would be Chivington's most vocal accuser for the rest of his life. Ned Wynkoop, Silas's closest friend, believed until his dying day that Chivington was responsible. But the truth would never be proven in a court of law. Squire, who had earlier been accused of attempted murder of another Denverite, but released on a jurisdictional technicality, fled the scene. He was later tracked down in New Mexico and brought back to face trial in Denver. Squire, the wayward son of a New York Episcopal preacher, languished in jail all that summer and fall, reportedly under shackled guard while awaiting many delays to his trial. Squire was eventually caught and brought back to Denver. Justice, it seemed, would finally be served, but then something strange happened. Just days before his trial in October, Squire escaped from jail with the help of unidentified Confederates. Again, accusations of a Chivington conspiracy to murder Soule arose, now expanding to the rescue of his killer from the gallows. Squire disappeared and was never seen in Colorado again. Just days before his trial, the killer escaped. Someone helped him. Someone with enough power and resources to get a man out of a guarded jail. And there's more. Squire was eventually caught and brought back to Denver City for a court-martial. However, the officer who captured Squire was found dead in a hotel with what was presumed to be a staged drug overdose. And Squire escaped to New York, where his influential family lived. The officer who captured Squire, Lieutenant James Cannon, died under suspicious circumstances. A staged drug overdose, they called it, and then Squire escaped. Cannon later testified against Chivington in the military investigation. He also arrested Captain Soule's murderer, William Squire, and soon thereafter died under suspicious circumstances after he brought Squire to face court-martial in Denver. Two men who stood against Chivington, both dead under suspicious circumstances. One shot in the street, one poisoned in a hotel. Squire escaped and was later captured but was never convicted. Morrow disappeared forever. No one was ever brought to justice for the death of Silas Soule. No one was ever brought to justice. Squire fled to New York, where his wealthy family protected him. Morrow vanished completely. Chivington was never charged with conspiracy. But fate has a way of finding the guilty. Squire then fled to Central America to avoid the law. His legs were crushed in a railroad accident, and he died from gangrene in 1869. Despite his crime, he was buried in New York with honors. The murderer drifted from job to job, attempting at one time to rejoin the army and later, unsuccessfully seeking passage to Central America. Squier's saga ended in 1869, when after 5 years of drifting through the shadows and evading arrest for the murder of Silas Soule, fate finally brought the killer to justice when Squier's legs were crushed in a railroad accident. 4 years after murdering Silas Soule, Charles Squier died in agony from gangrene after his legs were crushed in a train accident. He never faced a court, but he faced something worse, a slow, painful death far from home, his crime following him like a shadow until the end. And what about Hersa, the teenage bride who became a widow after only 22 days? Ned Wynkoop and Sila's brother William took Hersa to live with Sila's mother and sisters in Kansas after the murder, as they worried her life was in danger as well. They feared for her life. They believed whoever killed Silas might come for her too. So they sent her away to live with Silas's family in Kansas. Following his death, his widow remarried. She and her second husband, Alfred Lee, became the parents of the adventurer, author, and geopolitical strategist Homer Lee. Hersa eventually found love again. She married a man named Alfred Lee and had children. One of her sons, Homer Lee, would grow up to become a famous military strategist and advisor to Sun Yat-sen in China. It's a strange twist of history. The widow of America's first military whistleblower would give birth to a man who would advise the leader of the Chinese Revolution. Like Soule, she is buried in Denver's Riverside Cemetery. In death, they are reunited. Hersa Coberly Soule Lee lies in the same cemetery as the young captain she loved and lost after just 22 days. And what of Silas Soule's funeral? Soule's funeral on April 26, 1865, was attended by a large crowd with military and civil dignitaries. A journalist described the funeral as the finest ever seen in this country. Silas Soule's funeral, held just a few weeks after his wedding, was one of the most attended in Denver up until that time. The citizens of Denver City turned out in great numbers for the funeral of their beloved captain. He was buried at City Cemetery. A large memorial stone 6 feet high was erected above his grave. Soule was 27 years old when he died. The people of Denver mourned him. Whatever divisions his testimony had caused, the city came together to honor a man who had stood for what he believed was right, regardless of the cost. In 1867, Soule was posthumously brevetted to the rank of major in recognition of his meritorious service. On April 12, 1867, 2 years after his death, Capt. Silas S. Soule was breveted a major in recognition of his meritorious service to our nation. 2 years after his death, the military promoted him posthumously. They recognized what he had done. They honored his courage. Soule was first buried at Denver City Cemetery, now the location of Cheeseman Park. A large memorial stone was erected above his grave. The cemetery later closed, and many bodies, including Soule's, were transferred to Riverside Cemetery in Denver. Soule was translated to the Grand Army of the Republic portion of Riverside in May 1886, where he is still buried. Soule's large memorial stone was not moved with his remains, and he now has a standard soldier's gravestone. His original 6-foot memorial stone was not moved when his body was transferred. Today, Silas Soule lies beneath a simple soldier's gravestone, no different from the men buried around him. A visitor wouldn't know, just by looking, that this was one of the bravest men in American history. I visited his grave in the Riverside Cemetery in northeast Denver, marked by a simple gravestone not unlike those of his military brethren crowded around him. The surface of his grave was covered in dirt, sand, and clumps of parched grass, an ironic similarity to the ground of Sand Creek. A simple fist-sized rock lay upon the top of his gravestone, the only thing that distinguished this courageous man from those around him. I assumed that it was placed there as a sign of respect by the Cheyenne and Arapaho descendants of Sand Creek who had come there on Nov. 29, 2003, as part of the 139th anniversary of the 1864 Sand Creek Massacre, to honor Captain Silas Soule with a sunrise ceremony and a 4-mile spiritual healing run to the state capitol. They knew and appreciated what this man had done. Most of us do not. As I walked away from his grave, I was beset with a powerful feeling that his lying there in relative anonymity was somehow very wrong. But there are those who remember. Every year, the descendants of the people he tried to protect make a pilgrimage to his grave. From 1998 to 2019, a spiritual healing run walk was held in November to honor those killed at Sand Creek, after an interruption due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The run began again in 2024. It began at the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site in southeastern Colorado and concluded on the west steps of the Colorado State Capitol. Starting in 2003, a memorial ceremony was also held at Soule's grave site. The Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes visit the grave of Silas Soule every year during the annual healing run to honor victims of the Sand Creek Massacre. The Cheyenne and Arapaho people have not forgotten. They remember the man who refused to raise his weapon against their ancestors. They remember the man who documented the truth. They remember the man who gave his life because he could not stay silent. In 2010, the Colorado Historical Society unveiled a historical marker at the spot in downtown Denver where Silas Soule was murdered. The marker is 100 feet from 15th Street and about 100 feet from Arapaho Street, behind a black pillar supporting the building at that location. At this location on April 23, 1865, assassins shot and killed 1st Colorado Cavalry Officer Capt. Silas Soule. During the infamous Sand Creek Massacre of November 29, 1864. Soule had disobeyed orders by refusing to fire on Chief Black Kettle's peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho village. Today, if you walk through downtown Denver, you can find that marker. Most people walk past it without a second glance. They don't know who Silas Soule was. They don't know what happened on that spot more than 160 years ago. Although he only lived to 26, Silas Soule is remembered as one of the most important people in Colorado's history. Silas Soule is the reason that the truth of the Sand Creek Massacre is known today. He is remembered for his strong morals and bravery. His letters and testimony about the events of that day are the reason the truth of Sand Creek is known as a massacre rather than a glorious battle. Without Silas Soule, the Sand Creek Massacre might have been remembered as a victory. Without his letters, without his testimony, the official story might have been the only story. The victims might have been forgotten, their deaths celebrated rather than mourned. But because one man chose to tell the truth, because one man stood up when everyone else looked away, we know what really happened that November morning in 1864. Their reports, published in 1865, Congress, and 1867, U.S. Army, prevented the details of the massacre from being swept under the rug. Soule's and Kramer's letters changed history. In 1864, the letters had helped spark government investigations that uncovered the truth. Appearing just prior to the congressional hearing in 2000, the letters stimulated support for the creation of the historic site. The discovery of the Soule-Kramer letters and their recognition as critical evidence regarding the nature of the Sand Creek Massacre made newspaper headlines in 2000. Even in 2000, more than 135 years after Silas died, his words were still speaking. His letters helped convince Congress to establish the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site, ensuring that the victims would be remembered forever. The tragic story told in the letters led to a greater understanding of what horrors took place that day. And as a result, the site in southeast Colorado has been dedicated by the National Park Service as the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site. I said, "Who is he?" And my guide said, "Well, that's Silas Soule. He was at Sand Creek and disobeyed orders, and then wrote a letter about what he saw. And there was a congressional inquiry. And he was assassinated for speaking his truth." That's how author Nancy Nero first learned about Silas Soule. A portrait in a museum, a guide's brief explanation, and then decades of research that led to a book about his life and letters. For Nero, Soule's legacy serves as a guide for modern conversations on injustice, responsibility, and courage. "How do we raise our kids to know what right is from wrong?" she asked. "Showing up is moral courage, raising our kids to know right from wrong. That's moral courage," Nero, who is white, also said it's important for white people to engage with this history. "This is a white problem that must be solved. Racism is a white problem that is white people's duty and demand to resolve," she said. "We need examples like Silas to show us the way, how to show up and stand up and speak up with people of color." Silas Soule's story is not just about what happened in 1864. It's about what happens every time someone faces a choice between going along with injustice and standing against it. It's about the courage it takes to tell the truth when everyone around you would rather believe a lie. Silas Stillman Soule was an American abolitionist, teenage conductor on the Underground Railroad, military officer, and early example of what would later be called a whistleblower. He is honored as a hero for disobeying orders to participate in a massacre of Native Americans, and then giving evidence against his commander despite threats on his life. Today, we have a word for what Silas Soule did. We call it whistleblowing. We have laws to protect people who expose wrongdoing. We have organizations dedicated to defending those who speak truth to power. In 1865, there were no such protections. There was just a young man with a conscience, standing alone against powerful forces, knowing that the price of truth might be his life. And he paid that price. While Captain Silas Soule's name has largely faded into history, he stands out as one of the few bright rays of light in the moral darkness that surrounds the Sand Creek Massacre. A bright ray of light in the moral darkness. Let me tell you something about Silas Soule that I think matters as much as anything else in this story. Throughout his entire short life, from his childhood on the Underground Railroad, to his years as a jayhawker, to his attempted rescues of John Brown and his followers, to his refusal to participate in the Sand Creek Massacre, to his testimony that changed history throughout all of it, Silas Soule never stopped believing that doing the right thing was worth any cost. He could have stayed silent in 1864. He could have followed orders. He could have told himself that one officer refusing to shoot wouldn't make any difference. He could have protected his career, his reputation, his life. But that's not who Silas Soule was. That's not the man his parents raised. That's not the young man who guided enslaved families to freedom through the darkness of the Kansas prairie. That's not the 21-year-old who walked into a Virginia prison to try to save John Brown. Silas Soule believed that every person had inherent dignity. He believed that wrong was wrong, regardless of who committed it or what orders were given. He believed that the truth had power and that speaking it was worth dying for. He was right, because today, more than 160 years later, we are still telling his story. We are still learning from his example. we are still asking ourselves what we would do if we were in his position. Would we have the courage to refuse an order we knew was wrong? Would we have the strength to document what we witnessed, knowing the danger? Would we have the integrity to testify against powerful men, knowing it might cost us everything? Silas Soule showed us what moral courage looks like. He showed us what it means to be on the right side of history, even when standing there alone. And he showed us something else too. He showed us that even if you don't live to see the results of your courage, your actions can echo through time. His letters are still being read. His testimony is still being studied. His grave is still being visited by the descendants of the people he tried to protect. Around the anniversary of the Sand Creek Massacre, as descendants gather to remember those killed, she feels drawn again to his letters and the accountability they ask of readers today. Every November, when the Cheyenne and Arapaho gather to remember their ancestors, they also remember Silas Soule. They lay stones on his grave. They speak his name with gratitude. He was their friend when they needed one most. He was their witness when no one else would speak. He was their advocate when it cost him everything. And 22 days after his wedding, he was gone. Hersa Coberly Soule was 19 years old when she became a widow. She had barely unpacked her wedding gifts. She had barely begun to imagine what her life with Silas might become. All those dreams ended in an alley in Denver. Ended by bullets fired by men who couldn't stand that someone had told the truth about what they did. But here's what those men didn't understand. Here's what they couldn't know. You can kill a man, but you cannot kill the truth he spoke. Silas Soule's voice has outlasted his killers. His words have outlasted the men who wanted him silenced. His legacy has grown while theirs has turned to dust. Charles Squire died in agony, his crime following him to the grave. John Chivington lived out his days as the butcher of Sand Creek. His dreams of political glory destroyed by the testimony of a captain who refused to lie. And Silas Soule. He became exactly what John Brown predicted martyrs would become, more powerful in death than he ever could have been in life. Today, his story is being told in books, in documentaries, in classrooms. His name has been proposed as a replacement for locations in Colorado named after less worthy figures. His letters are preserved in archives, studied by historians, read by anyone who wants to understand what moral courage really looks like. He was only 27 years old. He was married for only 22 days. He lived in an era when the things he believed were considered radical, even dangerous. But he was right. History has proven that he was right. And that's the final lesson of Silas Soule's story. Sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything. Sometimes you don't live to see justice served. Sometimes the powerful escape punishment and the good die young. But the truth endures. The truth outlasts the liars and the killers and the cowards. The truth writes the final chapter. Silas Soule told the truth. And because of that, we know the truth today. That is his legacy. That is his gift to us. And that is why, every November, when the descendants of Sand Creek make their healing run across the Colorado plains, they pause at the grave of a young captain who stood alone against an army,